couple weeks, I'll be teaching my second fall reliable source workshop called Minor Blues and Bebop. And one of the questions that I've gotten a bunch is, well, what is the difference between a minor blues and a major blues? And in this lesson, I just want to give a quick overview of the difference in the chord changes between the minor blues and the major or dominant style blues. Because if you can understand the difference between the chord changes, then you'll understand what the difference is in how you need to solo over a minor blues versus how you need to solo over a major or dominant blues. So there are basically three main differences between playing a minor blues and a major or dominant chord based blues. And I'm going to go over these differences as they pertain to playing in more of a swing or jazz changes version of the blues. And basically, to start with, the first difference between a major and a minor blues is that a minor blues, the one chord is minor. And in the swing in jazz idioms, the default minor chord is not like a straight minor bar chord, but more of this sound like a G minor 6 chord with the root and the 6 and the flat third. And so what that means in terms of soloing is if you have a bunch of default licks where your hands just kind of land on those kinds of sounds where you're sliding into the major third, those are not going to work on a minor blues. The thing about playing a dominant chord based blues is that either minor or major sounds will work. That'll work, or that'll work. But when you're playing over a minor chord, only the first option is going to work. You got to avoid that major third because it's going to clash with the sound of the chord you're playing underneath. So that's the first difference, is that when you're on the one chord, you got to be careful not to play the major third. The second difference is that most often the 4 chord is also minor. And so this doesn't matter so much as far as playing those kinds of pentatonic licks, but if you're used to playing, again, brighter, more swing-based kind of licks, like things that really start to spell out the 4 chord as a dominant chord, those are also going to sound weird over this C minor chord, which in this case I'm playing as a C minor 6. So you have to be careful that if the 4 chord is minor, and it isn't always, but often is, then you need to replace those kinds of notes when you're playing the major third of the C chord, in this case, of the 4 chord. You have to make sure that you're playing the flat third of the 4 chord, which in terms of the home scale, if you're just playing a G minor pentatonic or blues scale, is the flat 6, not the major 6. So that's the second difference, is that you need to take into account that the 4 chord is going to be minor. And then finally, if you're playing on a more swing or bebop style blues in a dominant key, the turnaround is going to start with a 2 chord and go to a 5 chord. But the implication is that this is a regular minor 7 chord with a natural 5th. So the root, here's the flat 7, here's the flat 3rd, and if you included the 5th, it would be the natural note that occurs in that key. And that when you go to a 5 chord, it's going to be a dominant chord, and if you played it as a 9th chord, it would have a natural 9th on it, not necessarily a sharp 9 or a flat 9. But on a minor blues, the turnaround often starts with flat 6. In this case, E flat 7, but I'm voicing it with the 5th in the bass and then the 3rd. And that will in turn go down to a 5 chord. In this case, I'm just playing a D7, but voicing it with the 5th in the bass. But the implication is, this is an ordinary dominant chord where if you were going to have a 9th, the 9th would be natural, not sharp or flat. But that the 5 chord you get to after the flat 6 would indeed be an altered dominant chord, a D7 with a sharp 9 or a flat 9 or even a flat 13. So that's the third difference. And that means that when you're going to the 5 chord, you're going to the turnaround rather, approaching the 5 from either the 2 or the flat 6. On a dominant blues, it's going to sound good to spell out that natural minor 7 chord. Often from the flat 3rd to the 5th to the 9th, the 7th and the 9th. That kind of sound, which is implied by those kinds of licks. And then to play maybe bluesy stuff to take you back home, passing through things like that major 3rd on the 4 chord. But on a minor blues, you're going to need to find some way to spell out that kind of natural 9 on the E flat or the flat 6 chord, and then play more of an altered sound to take you back to the 1 chord. So this all comes back to this basic idea that if you understand the chord changes, the chord substitutions, the way that people in a particular idiom, whether it's Chicago blues or bebop or Texas blues or Western swing, if you know how people are thinking about the rhythm, about the chord progression and the choices they're making around the specific chords they're laying into that progression, you have an enormous advantage when you're trying to figure out how to solo over those chords. And it is often the kinds of chord substitutions, the kinds of chord choices, the nuances in things like what's going on around the 1 chord, the 4 chord, what's going on around the turnaround, that makes the difference between what you play over it sounding right or sounding like kind of clunky and like it doesn't really fit. So if this is something you'd like to learn more about, I will have some additional lessons coming up here on the channel about how to specifically address the chord changes I've just been talking about. And for a much more in-depth look at this topic, I invite you to check out my upcoming workshop from the Reliable Source series. The workshop is called Minor Blues and Bebop, and I'll be going into much more detail about all the things that are involved in playing the changes over a minor blues. So there's more information about that at the link below or the link on screen. And in the meantime, if you got a question or comment about today's lesson, please leave it down below. And as always, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.